The year is 1888. Southern France lies beneath a sky so impossibly blue it seems to mock the earth below. In the small town of Arles, the mistral wind howls through narrow streets, carrying dust and the scent of lavender fields that stretch toward horizons most will never reach. The air is thick with heat and the promise of thunderstorms that never come. Inside a yellow house on the Place Lamartine, a man sits alone at a wooden table, his hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of carrying too much beauty, too much pain, in a world that understands neither. The oil lamp flickers, casting dancing shadows on walls, painted the color of hope he cannot feel. Outside, the stars begin their ancient procession across the heavens, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to genius, indifferent to the solitary figure who watches them with eyes that see too much and understand too little of his own worth. The night air carries the distant sound of cafe conversations, laughter from people who sleep easily, who do not lie awake wondering if their sensitivity is a gift or a curse. You know this feeling, don't you? The weight of being awake while the world sleeps. The particular agony of possessing a vision that no one else can see, a truth that no one else will validate. You lie there in your own darkness, wondering if your pain serves any purpose, if anyone would notice if you simply stopped trying. Your mind circles like that mistral wind, relentless, exhausting, impossible to still. Vincent van Gogh knew this abyss intimately. He painted it in swirling yellows and desperate blues. He wrote about it in letters to his brother Theo, letters that reveal not just an artist's struggle, but a map for anyone who has ever felt too much, loved too deeply, and feared they were fundamentally unlovable. Tonight, we descend into his beautiful, terrible world, and perhaps, in understanding his pain, you will find permission to release your own. As you listen, slowly, we will walk with him through loneliness, suffering, and fragile hope, until your own storm begins to quiet. Brushstroke by brushstroke, thought by thought, breath by breath. We begin our descent not with paint or canvas, but within the sombre mist-laden fields of the Dutch countryside, where the earth seems to pull heavily against grey skies and silence speaks louder than any human voice. Picture the province of Brabant in 1853, windmills turning with mechanical indifference, canals reflecting nothing but clouds, flat horizons stretching toward promises of escape that deliver only more flatness. In this landscape of profound ordinariness, where conformity was virtue and deviation was sin, a child opened his eyes to a world already weighted with ghosts. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30th, but he was not the first Vincent. Exactly 1 year before, to the very day, his mother had given birth to a stillborn son bearing the identical name. The living Vincent grew up walking past the small Dutch Reformed church, where a gravestone bore his own name carved in cold stone, Vincent Willem van Gogh. Imagine the profound existential weight of such a beginning, to be a replacement child, a living memorial to someone who never had the chance to disappoint anyone. From his earliest memories, he existed to fill a void, his very presence a reminder of absence. You understand this feeling, don't you? Perhaps not in such literal terms, but you know what it means to sense that something about you was fundamentally wrong, fundamentally other. Maybe you were too quiet in a loud family. too intense in a casual world, too sensitive when everyone praised toughness. Maybe you learned early to perform a version of yourself that others could tolerate, while your authentic self retreated into internal exile until you could barely remember what genuine recognition felt like. Vincent's childhood was marked by this essential alienation. His father, a stern Protestant minister, valued duty over feeling, propriety over passion. His mother remained distant, her affection rationed like bread in winter. Vincent was awkward, intense, prone to strange obsessions, collecting beetles and bird nests with religious fervour, as if cataloguing the natural world might help him understand his place within it. Other children found him peculiar. Adults found him difficult. He found himself increasingly alone, wandering those flat fields, learning the terrible lesson that his internal landscape, vast, churning, full of colour and feeling, had no correspondence in the world around him. By adolescence, Vincent had accumulated failures that would define his self-image. Dismissed from an art dealership for his inability to feign enthusiasm for mediocre paintings. Unsuccessful as a teacher because his intensity frightened children, rejected as a missionary for caring too. Excessively about coal miners' suffering. Every conventional path closed like doors slamming in sequence, each rejection confirming his deepest fear. He was fundamentally unfitted for human society. And you, lying there in your own darkness, you know this accumulation of small abandonments. The jobs that didn't work out, relationships that dissolved, dreams revised downward until they barely resembled dreams at all. You know what it means to replay every failure in insomnia's theatre, wondering if there's something essentially wrong with you. Some defect others sense, but you cannot name. Yet consider this as you breathe slowly. Your loneliness is not evidence of brokenness, but testament to depth. The very quality that made Vincent unsuited for ordinary life, his capacity to feel intensely, would later allow him to see into the hearts of fields, faces, and stars. Tonight, let the geography of your own solitude expand into darkness, not as prison, but as vast, quiet space where you finally have room to breathe, unobserved and completely, safely yourself. In the year 1872, somewhere in a cramped room that smelled of turpentine and poverty, a 19-year-old Vincent van Gogh lit a single candle and reached for his pen. Outside, the Dutch night pressed against his window like a living thing, but inside, the world narrowed to ink, breath, and the soft scratch of writing. This ritual would continue for 18 years, producing over 600 letters to his younger brother Theo. Not mere correspondence, but arteries through which Vincent's mind bled safely onto paper, transforming isolation into the beginning of connection. These letters were lifelines thrown across an ever-widening abyss. My dear Theo, they almost always began, an incantation, a prayer to the one human being who had not yet turned away. Vincent wrote about everything, his failures, his money troubles, his dark moods that felt like drowning, his manic hopes that blazed and died like matches struck in wind. He confessed his terror of being 30 years old and still dependent on his younger brother's monthly allowance, the gnawing shame of needing support while producing art no one wanted to buy. But he also wrote about light, the way morning sun transformed ordinary wheat fields into cathedrals of gold, the dignity he perceived in peasants' weathered faces, the strange, fierce joy that occasionally broke through his despair like revelation. His letters oscillated between abyss and ecstasy, sometimes within the same paragraph, creating a portrait of consciousness that refused to settle into comfortable categories of sick or well, sane or mad. The correspondence was profoundly asymmetrical. Vincent wrote oceans while Theo replied in streams. Yet this imbalance did not diminish their bond. Vincent needed witness more than advice, acknowledgement more than solutions. He was not seeking to be fixed, but to be seen, to have someone confirm that his experience was real and his struggle mattered. Every confession, every desperate plea for understanding was an act of profound courage, the vulnerability of laying one's soul bare and trusting it would be received without judgment. You understand this need intimately, don't you? You know what it means to have thoughts that feel too large for casual conversation, feelings that seem to require more space than others are willing to offer. You know the modern paralysis of messages typed but never sent, the fear of being too much for the people you love. Vincent's letters remind us that the need to be heard is as primal as hunger, that speaking our chaos sometimes rearranges it just enough to survive another day. Vincent transformed his terror into descriptions, his loneliness into communication. The act of writing ordered his internal storm not by solving it, but by giving it form, making the unbearable slightly more bearable through the alchemy of language. Tonight, imagine your anxious thoughts as letters being written in invisible ink, confessions offered to the darkness itself. You don't need to solve them or send them. Simply let them be acknowledged, then gently released into the night, the way Vincent released his words across distance, carrying his solitude toward understanding, silence toward the merciful possibility of rest. Let us walk now through the gallery of closed doors, each one bearing the weight of another dream abandoned, another identity shed like an ill-fitting coat. By his 27th year, Vincent van Gogh had become a living catalogue of professional humiliation, accumulating failures with the dedication others reserved for success. Before the sunflowers blazed with impossible yellow, before stars swirled like divine breath across canvas, there was only the grinding, shameful reality of a man who could not seem to belong anywhere. Picture him at 19, working for the art firm Goupil in London, expected to charm wealthy clients into purchasing paintings whose mediocrity disgusted his sensitive soul. While others networked with practiced ease, Vincent brooded in corners, his fierce honesty making him unsuited for the delicate hypocrisies of commerce. His sincerity, that clumsy, burning authenticity you may recognize in yourself, proved incompatible with a world that required performance over truth. The dismissal came quietly, politely, but with finality. He tried teaching next, but his intensity unnerved children who needed lightness, not the weight of his philosophical observations. He attempted work as a bookseller, but the dusty silence of the shop only amplified the deafening volume of his internal chaos. Most heartbreakingly, he pursued religious calling, serving destitute miners in the Borinage region of Belgium. There, he gave away his belongings, slept on straw floors, wrapped himself in rags to live as poorly as those he served. The church authorities, offended by his extremity, dismissed him for undermining the dignity of the priesthood, rejected not for caring too little, but for caring too much. Imagine that walk home after the final dismissal. 27 years old, wearing peasant rags, speaking 3 languages but fitting nowhere, financially dependent on his younger brother's charity. His contemporaries were building careers, marriages, respectable lives, while he stood still in the mud of his accumulated shame. He lived in succession of shabby rooms, with damp-stained walls, ate bread and coffee when money allowed, nothing when it didn't. His hands were perpetually paint-stained, his appearance so dishevelled that proper society crossed streets to avoid him. You understand this particular species of exhaustion, don't you? The suffocating weight of society's timeline, the anxiety that whispers you are falling behind while others glide effortlessly toward success. You know what it means to be called too intense, too sensitive, too much by a world that worships smooth trajectories and curated achievements. Our productivity-obsessed culture offers no mercy for late bloomers, for those whose genius requires decades of invisible preparation, for souls whose depth cannot be rushed. Vincent internalized these judgments completely, measuring himself against conventional standards and finding himself catastrophically wanting. Yet here lies the merciful truth that only hindsight reveals: every failure was necessary pruning, stripping away identities that were never truly his, forcing him deeper into the canyon of his authentic self. Each closed door steered him, however painfully, toward the one path that could contain his particular vision. Tonight, as you catalogue your own disappointments in insomnia's theatre, consider that your struggles are not evidence of deficiency, but of depth. Your detours are not proof of worthlessness, but the difficult choreography by which your true self slowly, painfully emerges. Vincent became the patron saint of those who do not fit, the painter of failed lives, including yours. There is no late in the life of the soul, only the time it takes to become yourself. There exists a moment, quiet and terrible, when suffering ceases to feel like an unwelcome visitor and begins to feel like the only authentic inhabitant of your soul. Vincent van Gogh crossed this threshold slowly, almost imperceptibly, until his anguish was no longer something that happened to him, but something he had learned, in the most dangerous way possible, to cherish. To understand his tragedy, and perhaps to recognize the shadow of your own, we must walk carefully into this seductive territory where pain masquerades as identity. The sorrow is better than the joy, Vincent once confessed to Theo, a chilling admission that reveals how completely he had internalized the myth of necessary suffering. He came to believe that his melancholy was sacred fuel, that his isolation granted him access to truths invisible to the contented masses. In his letters, he wrote repeatedly about the necessity of his pain. One must undergo the death of living in the coal mine before one can depict it. His suffering became his credential, his proof of authenticity in a world of comfortable frauds. Vincent developed a complex, almost romantic relationship with his wounds. He starved himself not merely from poverty, but from a belief that asceticism sharpened his vision. He remained solitary not only because others rejected him, but because he feared companionship might dilute the concentrated essence of his feeling. The wound became his heavy coat, familiar, protective against the unpredictable weather of joy, but ultimately suffocating. You understand this pattern intimately, don't you? The strange comfort of familiar sadness, the suspicion that your anxiety, your overthinking, your sleepless vigils are integral parts of your identity. Perhaps you've caught yourself clinging to depression as evidence of your depth, your refusal to participate in shallow optimism. Our culture amplifies this dangerous romance, celebrating tortured artists and beautiful ruins, whispering that healing might make you boringly normal. That peace would somehow betray the intensity that makes you uniquely you. But here lies the merciful truth that Vincent himself might have grasped had he lived longer. His art emerged despite his suffering, not because of it. His greatest works were painted not during his deepest depressions, but in the fragile intervals of partial stability. Moments when the fog lifted just enough for his hand to steady, when clarity briefly pierced the chaos. The swirling stars and vibrant sunflowers were victories over darkness, not products of it. His pain was the mud he waded through, not the light he painted with. There is a profound difference between possessing a sensitive nervous system and actively courting misery. Vincent blurred this line tragically, confusing self-neglect with artistic integrity, mistaking familiarity for truth. His suffering did not create his genius, it was the obstacle his genius had to constantly overcome. Tonight, as you lie in this darkness, you are offered a gentle but radical invitation to release the romance of your own suffering. You do not need to be tortured to be deep. You do not need to be anxious to be creative. You do not need to bleed to be real. Healing does not mean becoming shallow. It means finally having the energy to express the depth you already possess. Imagine slowly unclenching your grip on your pain. Visualize it not as a treasure you must guard, but as a heavy stone you have carried long enough. You can set it down without losing yourself. You can find peace without sacrificing your soul. The wound does not need your love, it needs your acknowledgement and your willingness to tend it with the same tenderness you would offer a friend. Before Vincent van Gogh found his voice in brushstrokes, the world was already preaching to him in colour, not as decoration, but as divine revelation, as theology written in pigment rather than scripture. In the grey, conformist landscape of 19th century Europe, where academic painting favoured muted browns and polite realism, Vincent experienced colour not as aesthetic choice, but as philosophical necessity, a desperate attempt to communicate emotional truths that language could never contain. His revolutionary approach was heretical to the artistic establishment, yet it offers you, lying in your own darkness, radical permission to honour the overwhelming intensity of your inner life. Yellow became Vincent's obsession, his sacrament against despair, not the pale, cautious yellow of daffodils, but chrome yellow, cadmium yellow that screamed and blazed, the yellow of divine presence, of wheat fields burning with meaning, of sunflowers radiating stubborn hope against encroaching darkness. He painted his famous Yellow House in Arles as an act of chromatic faith. Walls drenched in optimism he could not genuinely feel, but desperately needed to believe possible. These were not mere botanical studies, but icons of gratitude, desperate prayers painted in thick impasto, crying out that despite poverty and loneliness, the world remained capable of overwhelming beauty. Each sunflower was a hymn against the abyss, yellow petals like flames refusing to be extinguished. Blue held equal power in his cosmology: cobalt, ultramarine, Prussian blue, the colours of infinite distance, of Mediterranean nights, of the vast indifference that paradoxically contains all human suffering. In the starry night, blue swirls with almost violent energy, suggesting that the cosmos itself is alive, churning with forces beyond human comprehension. His blues were never peaceful. They throbbed with the anxiety of eternity, the terror and comfort of insignificance simultaneously. Blue was the abyss he feared and the eternity he longed for, the color of drowning and of being held afloat by sheer magnitude. Vincent understood intuitively what neuroscience now confirms: color bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to our emotional centers. He wielded pigment like a mystic uses incantation, attempting to transmit feeling directly from his overwhelmed nervous system to yours. He painted shadows not as absence of light, but as presence of violet and green, skin not as beige, but as landscapes of pink, olive, and sudden flashes of red. His approach was not artistic, it was survival, translating his internal weather into a language that required no words, only eyes willing to be overwhelmed. You possess this same chromatic sensitivity, don't you? Your anxiety has a color, perhaps sharp electric white or suffocating gray. Your sadness might feel like heavy indigo, your fragile hope like pale gold. Vincent gives you permission to validate this internal spectrum, to recognize that your emotional intensity is not malfunction, but heightened perception. You are not experiencing reality incorrectly, you are experiencing more of reality than those with thicker emotional armor. Tonight, imagine your current state of mind as a canvas. Visualize your anxiety as a specific hue, vibrant orange perhaps, or electric red. Now very gently introduce white to it, watching the sharp pigment soften into watercolor wash, diluting into something you can breathe through. Your feelings remain valid even as their intensity becomes bearable, colors shifting and blending into the quiet, neutral tones of rest. In May of 1888, the Provenal sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient town of Arles, casting harsh shadows on cobblestone streets where locals hurried between patches of shade. Yet on the Place Lamartine, a modest two-story dwelling glowed like a beacon of defiant hope. Its exterior painted chrome yellow, so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own inner light against the muted limestone buildings surrounding it. This was Vincent van Gogh's Yellow House, not merely a residence, but a manifesto written in pigment. A fragile fortress built by a soul who had never known true sanctuary. For the first time in his 35 years, Vincent dared to dream of home. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. A studio of the South where kindred spirits could gather, create, and finally belong. He threw himself into preparation with manic devotion, painting the interior walls pale violet to complement the blazing exterior, the doors Prussian blue, arranging simple wooden furniture with the tenderness of someone building an altar. He hung his sunflower paintings like icons of hope, their golden petals radiating stubborn joy against the violet walls. This was a nest built by a bird that had never known safety, constructed from his meager allowance and vast emotional hunger. Vincent purchased extra beds, dreaming of the artists who would come, Gauguin first, then others, a brotherhood of the misunderstood who would finally understand each other. He envisioned communal meals, passionate conversations about art extending into the southern night, the validation that comes from being truly seen. For a man who had spent his entire existence as an outsider, the Yellow House represented Eden before the fall, the possibility of belonging made manifest in physical space. You understand this yearning for sanctuary, don't you? You know the exhaustion of performing normalcy, of translating your authentic self into something more palatable for public consumption. Your bedroom, where you lie now wrestling with sleepless thoughts, was meant to be your refuge. Yet anxiety has transformed it into a battlefield where rest feels impossible and wakefulness like eternal siege. The tragedy of the Yellow House lies in its fragility. Within months, the dream collapsed, Gauguin arrived, they quarrelled catastrophically, and the utopian vision disintegrated into the infamous ear-cutting incident. The sanctuary became a site of trauma. Yet the impulse behind it remains sacred, the recognition that sensitive beings require environments that soothe their overwhelmed nervous systems, spaces that reflect their inner world rather than society's chaotic demands. Tonight, reimagine your bedroom not as the scene of your insomnia, but as your own yellow house. These walls, however ordinary, are guardians of your vulnerability. The darkness is not enemy, but protective boundary, shielding you from a world that requires too much. Your sleeplessness is not punishment, but vigil, sacred hours when you are finally completely alone with yourself without apology. You do not need to fight for sleep, you can simply be awake in sanctuary, held by walls that ask nothing of you except to exist exactly as you are, unfinished and beautifully, perfectly human. There exists a seductive mythology that has coiled itself around Vincent van Gogh's legacy like ivy around a gravestone, beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. For over a century, the world has whispered about his madness with the peculiar fascination reserved for beautiful ruins, transforming his neurological suffering into romantic fable, his episodes of terror into aesthetic inspiration. Tonight, we must approach this shadowed territory with the careful precision of those who understand that legends are lazy things, flattening the complex reality of human suffering into costume drama for those who have never felt their own minds fracture. Vincent's mental illness was not a theatrical prop, but a devastating biological reality. Modern psychiatrists examining his letters and documented behavior suggest temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar disorder, acute intermittent porphyria, possibly exacerbated by malnutrition, absinthe consumption, and the toxic lead and cadmium in his beloved paints. His episodes arrived like sudden storms, auditory hallucinations that whispered accusations, fits of terrifying confusion where the self he desperately clung to dissolved into chaos, dissociative states where reality became a landscape he could no longer navigate. After the infamous night when he mutilated his ear, he woke in a hospital bed surrounded by white walls and the cold curiosity of townspeople who now regarded him as spectacle rather than neighbour. Yet here lies the crucial distinction that our culture consistently fails to grasp. The truth that could liberate you from your own fears about healing. Vincent created his masterpieces despite his mental illness, not because of it. His episodes were not periods of heightened creativity, but catastrophic interruptions that rendered him incapable of work, hospitalized, lost in terror that he himself described as unbearable. "If I could have worked without this accursed disease," he wrote to Theo, "what things I might have done." He did not cherish his illness, he endured it with the stubborn courage of someone who refuses to let suffering have the final word. Look carefully at the chronology of Vincent's most productive periods, and a different pattern emerges. The Starry Night was painted during a period of relative stability at the St. Paul Asylum, when medication and routine had steadied his mind enough for perception to organize itself into vision. His sunflowers blazed during months in Arles, when rest and structure provided fragile scaffolding for his consciousness. The swirling, passionate brushwork was not madness made visible, but sanity fighting desperately to impose order on chaos. Beauty wrested from the jaws of biochemical storms. You, who perhaps take medication for anxiety or depression, who lie awake wondering if treatment might flatten the peaks of your experience along with the valleys, need to hear this truth with perfect clarity. Healing does not diminish depth. Your sensitivity, your ability to perceive subtleties others miss, To feel the spiritual weight of ordinary moments exists independently of your suffering. The anxiety is not your creativity, it is the static disrupting your signal. The depression is not your profundity, it is the fog obscuring your natural wisdom. Our culture perpetuates a cruel irony, romanticizing Vincent's torment in retrospect, while stigmatizing those who struggle with similar conditions today. We frame his story as beautiful tragedy rather than preventable loss, celebrating his tortured genius while offering inadequate support to living artists battling mental illness. Vincent himself would have traded his posthumous fame for 1 year of peace, for a brain that did not betray him, for sleep that came naturally instead of eluding him night after night. Tonight you are offered radical permission to seek stability without fear of losing your essential self. Your medication, your therapy, your careful tending of sleep schedules and breathing exercises, these are not cages around your true nature, but scaffolding that allows the architecture of your being to rise without collapsing. There is no virtue in drowning when you were born to observe the water. Vincent's tragedy was not that he felt too much, but that he lived in an era with no adequate treatment for the neurological storms that ravaged him. You do not have to repeat his suffering to honor his depth. On May 8, 1889, Vincent van Gogh voluntarily crossed the threshold of St. Paul de Moselle Asylum in Saint-Irmy-de-Provence, entering walls that had once echoed with monastic prayers, but now murmured with the restless voices of unquiet minds. The ancient monastery, converted into an institution for the mentally afflicted, stood surrounded by olive groves and wheat fields that stretched toward distant mountains. Here, in this place where freedom was measured in supervised walks and barred windows, Vincent would discover his most profound artistic liberation, not despite his confinement, but because of it. He was granted 2 modest rooms, a sleeping cell barely 3 meters square with a single iron-barred window facing east, and another space that would become his studio. The window framed only a fragment of the world, a wheat field enclosed by walls, a cluster of cypress trees, a slice of Provenal sky. Where another soul might have seen limitation, Vincent glimpsed infinity compressed into manageable dimensions. His existence became governed by institutional rhythm, meals at prescribed hours, baths on schedule, walks under supervision. For a man whose chaotic mind had never known such structure, this external scaffolding provided what his internal world could never maintain alone. Within these constraints, something miraculous occurred. During his year at St. Paul, Vincent produced over 150 canvases, works that pulsed with otherworldly intensity, irises bending under their own purple weight, olive trees writhing like ancient dancers, cypresses rising like dark flames towards swirling skies. Unable to roam horizontally across landscapes, he was forced to go vertical, diving deep into the texture of a single flower, ascending high into the cosmic energy of night skies. The asylum garden became his universe, every gnarled tree trunk a study in endurance, every bloom a meditation on resilience. The hospital imposed the very structure Vincent's sensitive nervous system desperately needed but could never create independently. Between episodes, when clarity briefly returned, he worked with monastic discipline, as if routine itself were medicine. He painted what lay immediately before him, the enclosed wheat field visible from his window, the hospital corridors, the overgrown garden paths. Limitation did not imprison his vision, It concentrated it, like light focused through a lens, until it burned with unbearable beauty. You understand this geography of constraint, don't you? Perhaps your walls are not stone, but chronic fatigue that limits your energy. Financial obligations that restrict your choices. Family duties that tether you to familiar routines. Or simply the anxiety that keeps your world small and manageable. You lie awake cataloguing everything that confines you, convinced that your authentic life waits somewhere beyond these boundaries, that freedom exists in circumstances you cannot reach. Yet Vincent's asylum paintings whisper a different truth. Meaning is not found by escaping limitations, but by creating within them. Your current constraints, including this sleepless vigil, are not obstacles to your deeper life, but the very frame within which it must be composed. The bars on Vincent's window did not block transcendence, they framed it, forcing sustained attention that revealed the infinite within the finite. Tonight, imagine your own limitations not as prison walls, but as the edges of a canvas. Within this frame, however small it seems, there remains boundless space for depth, for quiet acts of attention, for the simple radical art of remaining present to this moment. You are not trapped, you are simply in your studio, learning to paint the view from whatever window you have been given, breathing slowly into the merciful boundaries of now. In the hushed corridors of St. Paul de Mausolles Asylum, when the last nurse had extinguished the oil lamps and the murmurs of troubled souls had finally surrendered to uneasy sleep, Vincent van Gogh would light a single candle and reach for his pen. The flame cast trembling shadows across his sparse cell as he arranged paper before him like a priest preparing for communion. This nightly ritual was not mere correspondence, but survival technology. A delicate architecture built from words to contain the chaos that threatened to consume him entirely. Each letter began the same way. My dear Theo, an invocation. A prayer cast across the void toward the one human being who still believed in his essential worth. Vincent understood intuitively what modern psychology now confirms: the act of articulating our demons diminishes their power over us. When anxiety remained wordless, it grew monstrous in the darkness of his mind, shapeless and therefore undefeatable. But when he could write, "I feel like a caged bird in spring," or describe his terror as a storm that passes through the soul, the overwhelming sensation transformed into something observable, manageable, contained within the boundaries of language. His letters became vessels that could hold his pain long enough for him to survive another sleepless night, another week of uncertainty, another canvas painted despite everything. Unlike his paintings, which captured raw, wordless energy in swirling brushstrokes, his letters imposed logic upon overwhelming sensory input. He wrote with meticulous detail about the chemistry of colors, the exact shade of olive trees outside his barred window, the philosophical implications of books he was reading. By naming his world, both external and internal, he regained some measure of control over it. "I am writing to you in the midst of a full-blown crisis," he would confess, his handwriting sometimes jagged with urgency, then smoothing as the act of writing calmed him. Each sentence was a small victory over chaos, each completed paragraph proof that his mind could still create order from disorder. You know this midnight struggle intimately, don't you? The way anxious thoughts multiply in darkness, becoming more monstrous with each repetition. Perhaps you compose elaborate messages you never send, draft explanations no one requested, rehearse conversations that will never occur. Your mind letters itself constantly, searching for the words that might finally explain you to yourself, seeking the sentence that could transform your suffering into something bearable. Tonight, you need not reach for actual pen or paper. Instead, imagine your restless thoughts as invisible correspondence being written across the darkness of your room. Each worry, each spiraling fear, each regret is a paragraph being composed in mental ink. Acknowledge each thought as Vincent acknowledged his, not fighting it, but giving it the dignity of articulation. I am afraid of tomorrow. I feel lonely tonight. I cannot quiet my mind. Once named, each fear loses some of its power, becoming manageable rather than overwhelming. Let these mental letters be completed, folded, and released into the forgiving night. You are not seeking solutions, but practicing the ancient art of witness, transforming chaos into communication, insomnia into vigil, your restless consciousness into something approaching prayer. In June of 1889, within the thick stone walls of St. Paul Asylum, Vincent van Gogh closed his eyes and summoned a sky that existed nowhere but in the geography of his restless mind. The view from his barred window showed only fragments: a wheat field, cypress trees, the distant spire of St. Army, but memory and imagination conspired to create something far more profound. Days later, in his modest studio, he would paint not what he saw, but what he felt the universe was trying to communicate through the inadequate language of starlight and darkness. The starry night emerged as Vincent's cosmological confession, his answer to the question that haunts every soul lying awake at 3 a.m. Does the universe care about human suffering, or are we merely accidents spinning through indifferent void? His response was neither comfort nor despair, but something more complex. A vision of the cosmos as alive, churning with energy that dwarfs human concerns, yet somehow includes them in its vast, incomprehensible dance. Look at how he rendered those 11 stars, not as distant points of cold light, but as spiraling vortices of energy, exploding in halos of yellow and white like divine breath made visible. The sky itself moves like water, like wind given form, swirling in great cobalt and ultramarine currents that suggest the universe is not a mechanical clock, but a living organism. This was not astronomical accuracy, but emotional truth. The night sky as it feels to someone whose nervous system perceives too much, who cannot filter sensation into manageable categories. The great cypress tree rises like a dark flame in the foreground, its vertical thrust bridging earth and heaven, mortality and eternity. Vincent identified with this solitary sentinel, rooted in particular soil, yet reaching toward universal mysteries. Below, the village of St. Arme sleeps in peaceful ignorance, its windows dark, its inhabitants dreaming ordinary dreams behind shuttered comfort. Only the church spire reaches upward, a gesture of aspiration that falls laughably short of the heaven's wild energy. You, lying awake while others dream, exist in this same liminal space between the sleeping world and the vast churning cosmos that never rests. Your insomnia grants you unwanted citizenship in the realm of eternal wakefulness, awareness of the immensity that continues its ancient rhythms, whether witnessed or ignored. This can feel like curse or strange privilege, the burden and gift of perceiving what others sleep through. Vincent offers you cosmic perspective as paradoxical comfort. Consider your mind as that painted sky. Your thoughts may swirl like those stars, looping and racing through the same anxious patterns. But beneath them exists a quieter village of breath and heartbeat, a small sanctuary of simple physical existence continuing regardless of mental weather. You need not silence the sky, you need only remember the village exists. Your suffering is simultaneously infinitesimal against eternity's scale and precious because of its very brevity. You are consciousness briefly flickering in an ancient universe, and this is both humbling and liberating. Against the backdrop of swirling galaxies, your specific anxieties lose their crushing weight without losing their validity. Tonight, imagine the ceiling above you dissolving into that compassionate, living sky. Let your worries join those painted stars, chaotic but beautiful, overwhelming but temporary. The universe churns on, indifferent yet somehow companionable in its eternal wakefulness, keeping vigil with you through this long night until your thoughts, like Vincent's brushstrokes, finally settle into the rhythm of rest. In nearly every canvas Vincent van Gogh completed, someone is conspicuously absent. An empty chair sits waiting for a visitor who will never arrive. A vacant bedroom echoes with solitude. Cafe patrons turn away from one another in practiced isolation. These paintings testify to a life spent perpetually reaching toward connection, yet finding only the cold air of rejection. There was Key, his cousin, who responded to his passionate declarations with a horrified no. Never. Never. There was the English landlady's daughter, who recoiled from his intensity. There was Sien, the prostitute he tried to save, but could not. Most devastatingly, there was Paul Gauguin, whose brief residency in the Yellow House ended not in artistic brotherhood, but in psychological violence and mutilation. Vincent's loneliness was not merely circumstantial, but constitutional. His absolute sincerity made polite society uncomfortable. He loved too fiercely, needed too desperately, demanded an emotional honesty that exhausted those around him. Even his beloved brother Theo remained hundreds of miles away, accessible only through letters that took agonizing days to traverse the distance between souls. Yet within this chronic isolation emerged something unexpected, a lens of terrible clarity. While others navigated the world horizontally, moving easily between social contexts and comfortable surfaces, Vincent was forced to go vertical, diving deep into whatever fragments of beauty or connection presented themselves. Unable to skim lightly across social waters, he plunged into depths where pressure increases, but where certain truths become visible to those willing to endure the descent. His exclusion from easy companionship granted him citizenship in a different realm. He perceived the profound dignity radiating from peasants' weathered faces, understood that their exhaustion was a form of nobility. He painted worn boots as meditations on labor and endurance, transformed wilting sunflowers into testimonies of stubborn beauty coexisting with mortality. His bedroom in Arles shows not mere furniture, but the ache of someone who has just left the room. The empty second chair reserved for every soul who has felt like an intrusion in their own life. You understand this exhausting vigilance, don't you? The way you replay conversations, searching for evidence of rejection, the social anxiety that transforms gatherings into performances requiring impossible energy. You scroll through curated happiness on glowing screens, seeking proof that belonging exists somewhere, that others have found the map you were never given. You are tired of translating yourself, of moderating your intensity, of pretending that small talk satisfies when your soul hungers for conversations that acknowledge existence's weight. Yet consider this merciful truth. Your solitude is not evidence of deficiency, but testament to depth. You are not a lighthouse that failed to become a cottage. You are a lighthouse performing exactly the function lighthouses perform, standing sentinel on rocky shores, perceiving storms others cannot yet see. offering illumination from your fixed position rather than wandering companionably through comfortable landscapes. Vincent never met you, yet he painted for you. Through his honest depiction of isolation, he created the very bridge that now connects him across time to your sleepless vigil. You belong to his invisible brotherhood, the fellowship of those who feel too much, see too clearly, and keep watch through long nights. Your sensitivity is not wall but instrument, your loneliness not punishment, but the specific angle from which your unique vision becomes possible. Rest now in this necessary solitude, breathing slowly into the quiet truth that some forms of seeing require distance, that your apartness might be not wound but sacred vocation. There exists a number that should devastate anyone who measures worth by worldly recognition, a statistic so brutal it indicts our entire system of determining human value. Vincent van Gogh sold exactly one painting during his lifetime. Not one collection, not one successful exhibition, one canvas. The Red Vineyard at Arles, purchased for 400 francs by a Belgian collector who likely bought it from pity rather than admiration. Everything else, the sunflowers now worth hundreds of millions, the swirling night skies reproduced in countless dormitories, the irises that shatter auction records, was rejected, ridiculed, or met with the devastating silence of complete indifference. Imagine the crushing arithmetic of such existence. Vincent produced over 900 paintings in a decade of manic productivity, pouring his entire consciousness onto canvas after canvas, only to watch them accumulate unsold in his brother's cramped apartment like evidence of magnificent delusion. Gallery owners dismissed his work as crude, too emotional, lacking the refined technique that defined artistic legitimacy. Critics, when they deigned to notice him at all, suggested he possessed neither talent nor future. He lived as a ghost who could not afford his own haunting, financially dependent on Theo's modest salary at 37. Humiliated by his inability to transform genius into the currency that society respects. "I can't change the fact that my paintings don't sell," he confessed to Theo with heartbreaking clarity. But the time will come when people will recognize that they are worth more than the value of the paints used. This was not arrogance, but desperate clinging to posthumous vindication, the hope that death might grant him the audience life denied. He died believing himself a catastrophic failure. His final words, reportedly, "The sadness will last forever." Not triumph, not artistic confidence, but the defeated whisper of someone convinced his existence had been one expensive, pointless mistake. You understand this particular exhaustion intimately, don't you? The feeling of shouting into algorithmic void, watching others receive recognition for work that seems less urgent, less sincere than your own desperate offerings. Perhaps you scroll past curated success stories, wondering why your efforts evaporate without acknowledgement, why your struggles remain invisible, while others seem to glide effortlessly toward validation. You are tired of meaning it without reward, exhausted by a culture that worships metrics you cannot achieve, followers, income, productivity scores that determine worth through external consensus rather than internal truth. Yet here lies the radical philosophy Vincent's tragedy whispers across time. Market value and human worth operate in completely separate universes. His paintings did not become masterpieces when the world finally decided to praise them. They were transcendent the moment paint dried in that asylum studio, regardless of who noticed. True success has nothing to do with applause or profit margins. Failure in Vincent's hands becomes not verdict but condition of authentic living, the inevitable byproduct of refusing to compromise your vision. of insisting on your clumsy, beautiful truth in a world that prefers polished performance. Tonight, release the exhausting ledger of accomplishments and embarrassments. Your worth is not fluctuating market price, but constant fact, indifferent to productivity or recognition. You are not behind, not late, simply unfinished, like one of his canvases drying slowly in silent darkness. Complete enough to be beautiful, yet still open to tomorrow's merciful light. On the 27th of July 1890, the wheat fields surrounding Auvers-sur-Oise rippled under a sky heavy with the particular blue Vincent had mixed countless times from Prussian and cobalt. That colour of approaching storms, of infinite distance, of the vast indifference that had both terrified and comforted him throughout his brief, burning life. The stalks stood tall and golden, moving in waves like the painted fields that had obsessed him, those endless horizontal expanses representing both the freedom he craved and the terrible openness of existence without shelter. Crows moved in dark, broken lines across this landscape, their harsh cries tearing the summer silence into jagged fragments. Vincent walked among these familiar forms, carrying his easel and paints, as he had done so many mornings before. But hidden in his pocket was something that transformed this ordinary Sunday afternoon into ending. A revolver borrowed under the pretense of frightening away those same crows. He was 37 years old, his body worn thin by a decade of poverty, malnutrition, and the exhausting labor of translating overwhelming sensation into paint. More devastating still, his beloved brother Theo was ill, struggling financially, newly burdened with fatherhood, and Vincent, whose care had consumed so much of Theo's fragile resources, had begun to believe that his death might be an act of mercy rather than tragedy. Somewhere among those golden stalks, in the landscape he had rendered sacred through obsessive attention, Vincent pressed the gun against his chest and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed once and was absorbed by the wheat, by the indifferent sky, by the vast continuing world that had never quite known what to do with his particular intensity. But the bullet missed his heart. He did not collapse in romantic tableau among his painted subjects, but stumbled back toward the Raveau Inn, bleeding internally, climbing those narrow stairs with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through years of rejection and ridicule. He collapsed onto his narrow bed in that small attic room with its slanted ceiling and single window. When the innkeeper found him hours later, Vincent was conscious, smoking his pipe with eerie calm. "I wounded myself," he explained simply, no elaborate justification, no dramatic confession, just the flat statement of someone who had made a decision and now waited for its consequences with the same patience he had once applied to waiting for paint to dry. Theo rushed from Paris, arriving just in time to hold his brother through the long, agonizing hours that followed. For nearly 2 days they sat together in that cramped space, speaking quietly while Vincent's life drained slowly away. There were no grand artistic manifestos, no triumphant declarations of misunderstood genius, only the exhausted intimacy of two brothers who had loved each other across impossible distances. Vincent apologized for the trouble he was causing, smoked when pain allowed, and whispered observations with heartbreaking lucidity. In the early morning hours of July 29th, he offered his final perception, La tristesse durera toujours. The sadness will last forever. Then he closed his eyes and released the unbearable weight he had carried for 37 years. "We must approach this ending with profound gentleness, you and I," resisting both the romantic notion that suicide was his artistic destiny and the harsh judgment that would condemn him for succumbing to genuinely unbearable pain. Vincent's death was not inevitable culmination, but tragic convergence. Untreated mental illness, chronic poverty, social isolation, and the sheer exhaustion of fighting daily battles against a mind that would not grant him peace. He did not die for his art. He died despite his desperate attempts to use art as reason to continue living. You, lying in your own darkness, perhaps understand something of this desolate geography. You know moments when exhaustion feels bone deep, when the effort required simply to exist seems disproportionate to any possible reward. You may have rehearsed your own absence the way others rehearse future plans. Felt the seductive logic of permanent escape from temporary anguish. If so, listen closely to the silence that followed Vincent's gunshot. It is not judgment, but grief. Grief for paintings unpainted, letters unwritten, summers unseen. His suicide solved nothing. It silenced not just his suffering, but every canvas he might have created, every sunrise he might have witnessed, every moment of fragile peace that could have accumulated into reasons for staying. Theo, devastated beyond recovery, died 6 months later, his heart literally stopped by grief. The sadness Vincent believed would last forever did not. It ended abruptly with him taking all possibility of transformation. Tonight, if similar darkness whispers its logic to you, remember this merciful truth. Suicidal certainty is mood, not prophecy. It feels eternal, but is, like weather, subject to change. Pain, however overwhelming in this precise moment, is not permanent condition, but passing storm. Vincent painted through countless storms and survived them, then painted more storms. What felt insurmountable in July's wheat field might have lifted by August, September, next spring. We cannot know, because he chose the only irrevocable solution to a problem that was, despite everything, temporary. You are not required to be Vincent. You can set down his story, refuse his ending, choose the morning he never reached. Your sadness will not actually last forever. Only your absence would. Rest now in this quiet truth, breathing slowly into the patient darkness that holds you safely until dawn arrives, as it always inevitably does. In this suspended hour between midnight and dawn, the boundaries of time dissolve like watercolor bleeding into darkness. And across 134 years, two restless souls converge in the democracy of sleeplessness. Vincent sits beside you now, not the mythical genius of museum walls, but the exhausted man with paint-stained fingers and tobacco breath. His eyes heavy with the same bone-deep weariness you carry. He does not need to see you to recognize you. Insomnia creates its own silent brotherhood. And the questions circling through your consciousness at 3 a.m. are precisely those that kept him writing desperate letters by flickering candlelight. Am I enough? Does my struggle serve any purpose? Will anyone notice that I tried? You and Vincent share citizenship in that borderless nation where anxiety speaks an unchanging language, where the particular loneliness of being awake while others dream creates identical geography, whether experienced in a provenal asylum or your contemporary bedroom. He worried constantly about money, just as you calculate and recalculate financial anxieties in darkness. He felt perpetually behind his peers, watching others achieve conventional success while he accumulated failures. The same comparison that tortures you as you witness others' curated achievements. He feared being a burden to those he loved, apologizing constantly for his emotional needs, just as you minimize your struggles to avoid exhausting the people who care about you. He created with desperate urgency, believing productivity might justify his existence. just as you push yourself toward burnout, hoping accomplishment might silence the voice whispering that you are fundamentally inadequate. Yet here unfolds the convergence that transforms everything. Your life, like Vincent's, is not a product requiring completion, but a canvas still accepting brushstrokes. In some quiet museum, his paintings hang behind glass, appearing finished to casual observers. Yet if you look closely, you sense something unresolved, energy that continues moving long after his hands turn to dust. The raw patches where confidence never took hold. The overworked sections where you tried too hard. The blank spaces where you have not yet dared to begin. These are not evidence of failure, but testimony to the ongoing work of becoming human. Vincent died believing his canvas was catastrophic accumulation of mistakes, never witnessing how his so-called failures would become sacred to future generations. How the very qualities he condemned, intensity, vulnerability, rawness, would be recognized as necessary, even holy. You do not need to be whole to be beautiful. Vincent's self-portraits show bandaged ears, hollow cheeks, eyes burning with unmediated pain, not healed but broken, and in that brokenness transcendent. Your anxiety, your depression, your chronic loneliness are not defects disqualifying you from meaningful existence, but textures giving your particular canvas its distinctive depth. He took his despair and made it blue, his hope and made it yellow. You have identical capacity to transform struggle into something approaching art. Even if your medium is not paint, but patience, kindness, or simply courage to endure another sleepless night. Tonight, accept the radical permission Vincent offers across time. You are allowed to remain unfinished. Your story continues accumulating meaning through honest incompleteness rather than forced resolution. Rest now in this patient darkness, breathing slowly into the merciful truth that becoming yourself is lifelong work. That your worth exists independent of productivity or recognition. That morning will arrive whether you solve anything or simply survive until dawn touches your still unfinished, perfectly imperfect canvas. The story releases you now, gently loosening its grip the way evening light softens its hold on the day. Vincent's voice fades into the general murmur of existence, his particular struggles dissolving into the universal ache that all consciousness carries. Then even that ache becoming something less defined, less urgent, requiring nothing more from your tired attention. You have walked with him through loneliness and wheat fields, through yellow houses and swirling night skies, and now it is time to let him rest, to let yourself rest. To allow his painted world to settle like fine golden dust over everything until even the dust becomes indistinguishable from thee. Merciful darkness that holds you. Picture again those 11 stars from his most famous canvas, but now they move more slowly, each spiral taking longer to complete its ancient rotation. The cobalt blue deepens into something closer to the color behind your closed eyelids. The village below begins its nightly ritual. One orange window darkens, then another, then 3 more, in gentle succession. The church spire fades into general darkness until you cannot quite remember if it was there at all. The sleeping villagers dream their ordinary dreams, and you are invited to join them, to release your claim on wakefulness, to stop keeping vigil over thoughts that will dissolve if they do not matter, or wait patiently until morning if they do. Feel the slow rise and fall of your breathing, chest lifting like those painted wheat stalks bending under wind that exists only in memory now. In and out, in and out. The rhythm is older than your questions, older than your fears. With each exhale, imagine one more sharp edge of the day dissolving. Vincent's brushstrokes, those thick ridges of urgent paint, begin to flatten and smooth. The desperate energy that drove his hand across canvas slows, stills, becomes simply color without movement. Then color without distinction. The yellow of his sunflowers, that chrome yellow he mixed with such hope, softens to cream, to pale gold, to the warm amber of candlelight, then to the gentle glow behind your eyelids. This gold begins to fill the space around you like honey slowly pouring, wrapping itself around the furniture of your thoughts, dimming the bright urgency of your worries. The wheat fields he painted with such obsessive attention gradually quiet their rustling, standing motionless now, then fading into the general gold of late sunlight, then into bronze, then into darkness that is not frightening, but soft, welcoming, warm as earth itself. Your thoughts are just birds flying over the field now. Let them fly. Small black shapes against the gold, crossing your vision and disappearing into horizon. You need not follow them. You need not catch them. Let them go. Let them fade into distances where you need not follow. The cypress tree stands watch in the distance, dark and still, an anchor connecting earth to sky, waking world to dreaming world. It stands perfectly still, so you do not have to. You can let go of your vigilance, because the tree is watching, the stars are watching, the night is watching. Everything is slowing down, smoothing out like cool water. There is no more struggle, no more pain, only color and quiet and the gentle dissolution of all sharp edges into gold, into blue, into the particular darkness that asks nothing except breath, except release, except sleep. Sleep, sleep, now. Dissolving, dissolving, dissolving into gold.